Thank you for that kind introduction. I'm never quite sure what it is to be a global thinker, except that it means you write in English, which helps. So thanks very much. Now, the book that I've just published and that ostensibly I'm supposed to talk about is a collection of essays that I've contributed over the years to the New York Review of Books. And it's, of course, a little difficult to say anything very coherent about a collection of essays, even though I did try and give it a certain shape, and it raises a few questions that I'll touch upon, and then open the floor to you, and then perhaps we can have a discussion. It's called A Theatre of Cruelty, and it's not about Antonin Artaud, but it is, a lot of it is about art and violence and how death and violence and the fear of death and so on is expressed in art and in film and in literature and so on. Now, why would I be so interested in that? One of the reasons, as is usually true when people write books, is autobiographical. I was born at the very end of 1951 in the Netherlands, a country that had just been, a few years before, had been occupied by Nazi Germany. And so my generation grew up very much in the shadow of World War II. You were always aware of it. Some of us became rather obsessed by it. And it was always there. And when I was at primary school in the late 1950s, early 1960s, it was very clear, in the Netherlands at least, who'd been good and who'd been bad. It became a kind of moral yardstick. All my primary school teachers had, of course, been brave resistance heroes. And they all had a tale of showing a German soldier who asked the way to the local railway station and pointing him in the wrong direction and so on. They'd all been brave and morally terrific. And the kind of boys' stories that we read about the war were always about sort of brave young resistance heroes as well. So it was very clear the Germans were very bad, we were very good, and that gave you a certain air of moral satisfaction as you grew up. It was so clear-cut, really, that we also knew not only that our primary school teachers were all brave resistance heroes, but we also knew that you couldn't go and buy candy at a particular cigarette store because the woman who works there had a German soldier boyfriend, or you couldn't go and buy meat at a certain butcher's because he'd been bad, whatever he'd done. We knew all that absolutely perfectly. So we grew up with this kind of World War II as a clear-cut moral compass. Now, this changed, like everywhere else, really in the course of the 1960s, along with the student revolts, which, again, happened all over the Western world, and indeed in parts of the non-Western world, Japan, Mexico. I don't know whether one would count it as the Western world. I suppose one would, but it happened everywhere. And that had a lot to do with the way that World War II was seen in retrospect. Part of the student revolt was really against, and this is certainly true in Germany and Japan, against the parents' generation for having collaborated, for having been Nazis, for having looked in the other direction when terrible things happened, and so on. And the students who took part in these demonstrations had a certain moral smugness of their own. We're going to do it differently. We are now in the resistance where our parents failed, and so on and so forth. Now, one thing that led to was a slightly more honest assessment of the war, and which again sometimes went to the opposite extreme, as though everybody, not only that not everybody had been a resistance hero, but everybody in some ways was tainted. Everybody had looked in the other direction when Jews were deported. Everybody was a collaborator of one kind or another. Now that's just as false as the idea that everybody had been brave and heroic. In fact, there were many gray areas, but I think in most occupied countries, the statistics, to the extent they can be known, are more or less similar, which is that there was a small number of people who actively resisted, up to 10%, maybe, if that. There was a small number of people who actively collaborated. more or less the same number probably, and then the majority try and survive as best they can in terrible circumstances. Now maybe as a result of that early moralism of my childhood, I became much more interested really in the question of what makes people behave badly than what makes people behave heroically. Why do people collaborate? Under what circumstances would you do so? How would I have reacted? I mean, the question that is often asked of how would I have behaved under torture? Would I have spilled the beans? I find less interesting, partly because you can never know. But I can imagine circumstances in which one can behave badly, not necessarily become a torturer, but there are so many ways in which human beings can make compromises in very difficult circumstances, or what my friend, the Israeli philosopher Avishai Margalit, calls rotten compromises. And sometimes it can be as banal as something like real estate. You see these over and over again in periods of persecution and oppression. The neighbors who'd been your friends all your life, whose children went to your children's birthday parties and so on, suddenly they're kicked out of their apartment, the apartment vacant, it's yours for the taking. People take it very often. And there are other moral dilemmas involved where people the desire for power over others, all kinds of reasons why people can actually end up behaving badly, behave violently, and so on. And maybe also for that reason, I became very interested in the way that the Germans and the Japanese remember their history, rather than the more moralistic Dutch or British or Danes or whoever else could feel that they'd been victimized by what happened in World War II. That people were victimized is clear, but I find the identification with victims and victimization, in my case, I find it slightly dubious. I try to resist it. My mother was Jewish, but her family lived in England, and so they were not directly involved, not under Nazi occupation. And I know from myself how tempting it is, as you leaf through yet another book about the Holocaust, sometimes with the wrong kind of fascination, how tempting it is to think, I could have been one of those people in a concentration camp, and it can give you a kind of warm glow of moral, almost superiority, which I think is something to be deeply resisted, because people of my generation didn't survive anything. Our parents may have done, or our grandparents, but we didn't, and we shouldn't bask in any kind of glow as a consequence. And I find some of the stuff I've written in this collection of essays is directly about that. It's about the sentimentality of the wrong kind of identification. Now, I got interested in Germany and Japan. Germany because I grew up with it. Japan initially not because of anything to do with World War II. I went to Japan because I liked Japanese movies and theater and so on, and I went as a student with a scholarship at the film school in Tokyo. But as I lived there in the 1970s, I got more and more interested in the ways that the Japanese remembered their war. And then I wrote a book comparing the ways that the Japanese dealt with their history with the Germans, and rather resisted, even though it was not always read that way, but resisted the cliche that the Germans dealt with it wonderfully well and the Japanese just sweep it all under the rug. Reality is more complicated. The war itself was different in Europe and in Asia, and so on. But so the fascination that is very much part of the essays in this book with why people behave badly, how people think back on the dark sides of their history rather than the heroic sides and so on, began to preoccupy me more and more. And that, I suppose, is the reason also why I got interested in the way that art represents violence and death and our fear of violence and death, which I think a lot of art does, not all art, of course, but a lot of it. Everything from Hollywood schlock to some very fine painters and writers and so on. That art is one way, art and religion, and they're of course very intimately linked, are ways to deal with our fears of these things. And in some ways it's acting out in a sort of ritual manner almost, or in the imagination, things that we're frightened of if they were acted upon in reality. Some of the essays are about artists I particularly admire, of the Weimar period in particular, the 1920s. And one of the things I find interesting about it is that German artists in the 1920s who'd been through World War I, the horrors of World War I, and then found themselves in a society where so much had broken down as a consequence of it, and there was so much violence in daily life that they expressed it directly in their art. And the art was, it's not all about violence and moral breakdown, but a lot of it is. And so I tried to come to grips with that by writing about people like George Grosz and Max Beckmann and Kirchner and so on. And by the way, a lot of post-war Japanese art is very similar, post-World War II Japanese art, in that contrary to the received opinion that the Japanese have simply swept everything under the rug, there's actually quite a lot, especially in the late 50s and 1960s, in Japanese art and writing that is directly related to what happened in World War II. Now, if you think of Western art history, a lot of the violence and the death and our fears of it and the ways that we try and cope with it are, of course, part of religious art. And if you think of a lot of Christian art, it's in fact completely preoccupied by violence, martyrdom, torture, death, and so on. More, I would say, than most, the art of most religions. There is a bit of this in Buddhism too, in Tantric Buddhism, where the grotesque is accentuated as one way to deal with decay, with death, with violence, and so on. Christian art, of course, is soaked in it. And I think it's again what I alluded to earlier on. It has a lot to do with the way that we want to, in our imagination, cope with things that we hope won't happen in reality. And that includes our own propensity to violence, which is in all of us. And I won't, there is of course a long going discussion about what makes people behave violently. And one school of thought is that it's in all of us, it all depends on circumstances. If the circumstances are right, we could all become killers and torturers and so on. I wouldn't go that far. I think a lot of it has to do with circumstances. I'm personally convinced that when authorities give people absolute license to do whatever they like with other people, exercise their power over other people in any way they wish, it leads directly to torture. I think I have a rather pessimistic view of mankind in that sense. But I don't think everybody would be a torturer. I think some people are more likely to do it than others. But circumstances certainly do account for a lot of it. Hence, the fact that you can find people who are perfectly neighborly and friendly, and in a change of circumstances, the wars in the Balkans recently showed this very clearly. People Bosnian Muslims and Serbs who'd lived together perfectly amicably, suddenly turning on one another and doing the most terrible things. The same thing happened in India in 1947, after independence, when India and Pakistan, when India was divided into two states, and Hindus and Muslims who'd lived together perfectly harmoniously suddenly would indulge in the worst kind of violence. Now, again, not everybody, but it can happen very quickly. And it has to do with our desire for power over other people and so on and so forth. But it does happen, and it needs to be explained, and it is an extraordinary phenomenon. And I think art and ritual and religion, all in their different ways, deal with this. The most obvious example, I suppose, is the Spanish bullfight. which was originally a religious ritual, probably started in the Moorish period. It came from North Africa. And it's a ritual of death, which is then turned into a form of art. And it's done, in other words, to cope with something we know that is deep inside us. It's something that we're afraid of, and we make something beautiful, if one can call the killing of a bull beautiful. But there is a certain, even those who are against it could not deny that there is a certain beauty to the spectacle. And I think that's just a very clear example of where art and ceremony and religion meet. But there are, of course, many other ways. And one thing that's linked to this, which again is one of the essays in the book, and it's something that preoccupies me, is how people behave in a religious manner, again, often to do with death and violence, even when it's not a part of organized faith as we understand it. And I wrote an essay about the way Anne Frank and Anne Frank's diary has been received. And one of the fascinations of this, and I won't go into all the discussions about Anne Frank and what her father wanted and what critics of her father wanted and so on and so forth, but one of the fascinations is how it has become almost like a religious cult. When you go to the Anne Frank house in Amsterdam and you see the queues around the block and so on, it's partly a tourist attraction, which is tawdry in some ways. It's a bit like, tourists flocking to Auschwitz in great buses and taking selfies of one another in front of the gate. It's partly that, but it's partly that it is a kind of pilgrimage site. And people have developed, how shall I put it, spiritual is perhaps not quite the word, but religious attitudes to it. And Anne Frank, who was a very gifted and sensitive young woman, has become more than that in the eyes of many people. She has become a kind of saintly figure, a martyr, which of course is not at all part of the Judaic tradition. It's very much part of the Catholic tradition. And I would say that in some ways Anne Frank as a martyr figure is a more Christian figment of the Christian imagination than it is of the Jewish one. And I would also assume quite a lot of probably the majority of people who queue up at the Anne Frank house for their pilgrimage are indeed from a Christian background. But as an illustration of how far this can go, recently there was a great kerfuffle about I think it was an oak tree or maybe a birch, I can't remember, but a tree that Anne Frank saw from her window on the rare occasions that she dared open the curtain, because if anybody spotted her, they were in great danger. And she saw this tree in the garden behind the house, which she described. And the tree, many years ago, died. And it was decided that it was really time to cut down this dead tree. And there was an enormous uproar. How could they? This was the tree Anne Frank saw. How this is an absolute outrage and a form of blasphemy to cut down the tree behind the house where Anne Frank's family had been hidden. And finally, I think it has been cut down, and now like splinters off the cross, bits of the tree have been distributed all over the world, from Japan to, I believe, even there's a splinter in the Holocaust Museum on the Mall in Washington, although I'm not sure about that. But this is an illustration of how something that has become a symbol of something we all fear, persecution, violence, death, and so on, is being dealt with in a religious fashion. It's being ritualized, it's become a kind of spectacle, and so on. And I don't say this with an air of superiority, of how pathetic those people are and how sophisticated I am, and not at all, because I think one feels it in one's own soul often, the temptation to deal with things that are very difficult to deal with rationally in another way. And as an illustration, I too once visited the Auschwitz camp when I was doing the book on Germany and Japan, in fact. And I remember walking along the railway lines in what was Birkenau, the actual death camp. And I had to fight the temptation not to pick up a cinder or a little stone or a rock, and put it in my pocket as though something sacred had seeped into this, because this was, in a sense, sort of holy ground. And I knew perfectly well that I was being completely irrational, and the stone's a stone. There was nothing special about it. But the temptation was there, and I think this is a very human impulse, because horrors like that are very difficult to deal with entirely rationally, dispassionately, from the point of view of a historian. I mean, it's so dark and so much part of the human experience and so mysterious in the end that people find other ways of coping with it. The last issue I would like to raise before I ask you to participate in this discussion is really about the issue of whether the depiction and the imagining of violence, and of course sex is very closely linked to this, itself can provoke violence, provoke the very thing that we're afraid of. And this is, of course, an eternal discussion, whether pornography leads to bad behavior, whether violent art, violent movies, and so on make people behave violently, etc. There is a school of thought amongst a certain group of feminists, at least, that actually believe that pornography is not just fantasy. Pornography is rape. And so I think Catherine McKinnon, but there are people here who know more about these things than I do, but was one of those who argued for laws that would ban pornography for that reason, for feminist reasons, not for Christian moral reasons. Because as she and others said, pornography is rape. Now, I don't believe that. I don't subscribe to that, but I can see that it is a very complicated issue, and there aren't always such easy answers. Where do you draw the line? I would say I wouldn't be in favor of banning any pornography, really, or even the depiction of violence. And I think one should be careful not to make too clear a distinction between good art and bad art, which was very much the argument when the case over D.H. Lawrence's Lady Chatterley's Lover had to be decided in a court. I can't remember the exact year, it was early 60s in the United States. And the ban was lifted. It was allowed to be published in the end because the argument was this is literature, it's uplifting in some ways, and therefore the depictions of sex are okay. Whereas if something is not literature or not great art or not supposed to be uplifting, it would not be. I myself am very skeptical about making those distinctions, because who's going to make them? Do we ask our judges to decide what is great art and what isn't great art, or what has literary merit and what doesn't? I mean, this is not really up to them. And nor do I think there is a sort of rather old-fashioned notion expressed if you find books of the I can't remember when they actually stopped this practice, but if you go to second-hand bookstores in Europe, or maybe here, you'll still find books published before World War II and possibly afterwards, where the racy passages are in Latin, and the rest would be in English. And the thinking behind this, and this has led to great frustration in my own case. I remember. But the reasoning is what's okay for me is not good for the staff. If the servants should not be able to read this, it's okay if I read it. But the working class would be deeply corrupted if they read it. And there is something of that in deciding these cases on whether something has literary merit or doesn't. So I don't think pornography should be banned, but where should one stand then on paedophile pornography, for example, which is one of the last great taboos of our societies? There seems to be no question that the use of children for pornographic purposes should definitely be banned, because people would be exploited in the most terrible manner, people who have no say over it themselves, and so on and so forth. But in many countries, and possibly the United States, one of you can probably, I'm sure, confirm it or not, but even have a ban on virtual images that are pedophiliac. Certainly in Britain this is the case. So even an animation film on pedophiliac sex would be banned. And there my personal inclination is to think that goes too far, because in general, I think, and this goes back to what I've already been saying from the beginning, I think art, good or bad, is a way to cope with things which we find disturbing, frightening, and so on. And it's better to express them in art, desires that, if we carry them out, might be undesirable, and pedophilia might be one of those desires. It's better to act out, or in fantasy, in the imagination, than it is to ban it and to push it underground, and which could lead to far more undesirable consequences. I suppose another analogous example of this, which is not really about art, but it's about spectacle, is a discussion of soccer hooliganism. In many ways, the soccer stadium, since World War II in Europe, became a place where taboos could, almost in a ritual fashion, a little bit like the bullfights, could be acted out. And people act out taboos in soccer stadiums in Europe in ways that are unimaginable in a baseball stadium in the United States, which even football stadiums and crowds in the United States are unbelievably civilized compared to soccer crowds in Europe. And there is a reason for this, because since World War II, one of the taboos in Europe concerns nationalism. That the kind of flag-waving, hand on the heart, listening to national anthem and that kind of thing, which in America is taken for granted because for historical reasons, and were entirely part of culture in Europe as well before the war, after the war became almost taboo, because this had led to 2 world wars. People said that kind of nationalist sentiment leads straight to fascism and Nazism, and we know what happened. We're now Europeans. Those kind of sentiments cannot be expressed, and the same is true of any kind of ethnic or racial slurs, stereotyping, etc. All this should be absolutely banished from public behavior, because otherwise we're going to end up in the Gulag or with Auschwitz again. The football stadium became, as it were, the bull ring where these taboos could still be broken. And not only the flag waving and the anthem singing and all the tribal behavior, but also the racism, the ethnic slurs, and the really violent sentiments against rival fans and so on. There was a famous Dutch football coach once, a very successful football coach who led the Dutch team to beat the Germans in 1988, which led, by the way, to greater celebrations in the streets in Holland than on May 5th, 1945, when Germany was actually defeated in the war, which shows you the emotion that goes into spectacle of this kind. And one of his famous phrases was, "Football is war." And the football stadium did become, in many ways, a kind of reenactment in the imagination, in spectacle of war, of violence, of racism, and so on. Now, why do I tell you this story? Because in some ways, it's like the argument on pornography. There are those who say, if you allow people to behave, football crowds to behave like that, then that's what leads to the kind of violence that has often been associated with soccer games. If you would ban it, the violence would cease. Now, the other argument is these sentiments are there, these desires are there, better to let people vent them and act them out in soccer stadiums than in any other way. Any other way would be much worse, would be more dangerous, it could become political and so Myself, on balance, but this is where discussions are helpful, because my opinions on this are not unequivocal, because I don't think they can be. I think there are arguments on all sides. But myself, I tend to side with the First Amendment in the United States Constitution, that only if you can show that there is imminent danger of violence should something be legally banned. In Europe, people take a slightly different view. They feel that according to the European laws, offense, actually insults on the grounds of race or creed or sexual orientation are actually illegal. Even if you cannot prove that there is an imminent danger of violence or it leading to violence. Now, I'm skeptical, as I said, about that view, even though I can see the merits of the argument. It's very tricky, for example, if you say everybody should be able to say about everybody else what they want. Fine, sounds very liberal and all that. But there is such a thing as majorities and vulnerable minorities. Now, if everybody can say about anybody else whatever they want, that puts minorities at a great disadvantage, because it means that majorities who are more comfortable, more powerful, and so on, can abuse minorities, whereas whatever minorities do will never have the same kind of impact, which, if you want the playing field to be level in a liberal democracy, can be problematic. We also know that what people say, what minorities say about themselves, are not what majorities can say about minorities in practice. I mean, you know, a Jew telling a Jewish joke is not quite the same thing as a big blonde German telling the same Jewish joke. So it's a tricky thing. But my conclusion, and I'll really stop with that, is that one should probably make a pretty clear distinction between how one uses the law and how one uses custom. And as far as the law is concerned, I would, as I said, be very much inclined to the First Amendment in the United States. Custom is something else. Even though you can say legally, everybody should be able to say whatever he wants or she wants, as long as it doesn't directly lead to violence. In fact, in daily life, of course, this doesn't quite work that way. And that's true of the United States. It's actually rather an interesting case, because if you compare the exercise of free speech in the United States than in Europe, you could argue, and I have no statistical proof to back this up at all, but that in the United States, legally, we are freer to say anything we want. But in fact, people are more politically correct than they are in, say, France, where legally they're allowed to say less, and maybe as a direct consequence, in private, defy the law or push the law more than people are inclined here. In other words, you could argue that the freer you allow people to be legally, the more civilized their behavior might be as a consequence. Now, this is something that, of course, I cannot prove at all, but it's possible. But in custom, or what we're accustomed to say, is very different from what the law allows us or doesn't allow us. You can say, legally, you can use all kinds of terrible words about Jews or blacks or Muslims or anything. In fact, none of those words would ever be published in the New York Times. And that has nothing to do with the law. It's that we know we have certain norms that we more or less agree upon, not totally, of course, but we more or less agree upon, that cannot be said, cannot be done, cannot be expressed. And that, again, depends very much on circumstances. It depends on politics. It depends on the audience, and so on. What a right-wing Republican radio jockey can get away with, the President of the United States could certainly not get away with, even though legally they're both allowed to say whatever they like. But these things are so contingent on circumstances, who you are, under what circumstances you say them, and so on and so forth, And so I think even though one can defend the First Amendment legally, in fact, newspaper editors, radio producers, university professors, and so on, are constantly, journalists, constantly have to negotiate and find ways to find some kind of common norm, which changes, of course, with time, on what one should be able to say about others and what one shouldn't be. And the same, of course, goes for sex and violence. And I don't think one can ever get this completely right. It's always a matter of compromise, of pushing. Artists and others will push the borders, others will push back, and so on. It's a question of constant negotiation. I don't think we always get it right. All we can hope for that sometimes we get close. And with that, well, I'll close my remarks and throw it open to you. Yes.
It seems to me you talk about the people in an occupied country.
Right. Yes.
But there's 80% in the middle,
right,
who tend to appear to be exonerated because they're just going about their life.
Yes.
But is there an argument that they are guilty of the sin of omission? They should have been motivated.
I understand what you're saying. Yeah, no, you're talking about a country under occupation, or those who... Okay. Well, I don't think anybody should be under any obligation to join the resistance, for example. People join the resistance for all kinds of reasons. And resistance, especially when it's armed resistance, is always problematic. Because very often, and which is why people who join the resistance are very rarely popular amongst the majority, even though some people then become the stuff of myth after the war. But it often leads to reprisals which are much worse than they would have been otherwise, and so on. And people join the resistance sometimes out of absolutely noble motives, that's the only decent thing to do. Others do it for religious reasons, others do it because they want adventure. One of the most interesting texts on this, which I don't think has been translated, was written by, but it impressed me a lot, was written by a Dutch painter called Armando, who lived in Berlin for many years. And he did interviews with Dutchmen who joined the Waffen-SS during World War II and fought on the Eastern Front and that kind of thing. And he found out that the majority had not done so because they were interested in Nazi doctrine. The majority had done it because they were often from small towns, had rather authoritarian fathers, were bored, they wanted adventure, they wanted gunplay, and very often one brother would join the Waffen-SS and the other brother would join the resistance for very similar reasons. So I don't think anybody should be under that obligation. Active collaboration is again something that one should not condone. Looking after your own under very difficult circumstances, trying to make the best of things, trying not to behave, trying not to make rotten compromises is not heroic, but I don't think one should condemn it morally either. And I'll give you an example, and that's in a way how I started my book on 1945, the year zero, which starts with the example of my own father. And he was a law student in 1941 and 42 in Utrecht in Holland. And students had to sign a loyalty oath to the Nazi occupation. If they didn't, they would be deported to Germany, would have to work in the war industry, in factories and that kind of thing. So most students went underground, as did my father, because he didn't sign this loyalty oath. Now there, I think there is a moral issue. I think those who did sign the loyalty oath did not do the right thing. In any case, something went wrong. My father was called back by somebody in the student underground who probably screwed up, and was met by his father, my grandfather, at a railway station, and they were surrounded. There were a lot of German police around, and it was announced that those who didn't sign up for war industry in Germany, their parents would be arrested. Now, my father could have got away. He could have done something heroic and jumped out of a queue and so on. He didn't dare do it because he didn't dare risk that his parents might have to face the consequences. Now, he himself has sometimes told me that he still has sleepless nights thinking about how he could have got away and that he wasn't brave enough and so on and so forth. I would never morally condemn him for that, because I think that falls in the category of you do as best you can, and especially when it involves other people. So those are the kind of dilemmas people are faced with, people in that 80% mainstream. But well, not to make this too long, but I mean, the argument, one of the vulnerabilities in Hannah Arendt's book on Eichmann in Jerusalem is precisely about this issue, that she rather condemns the Jewish councils in ghettos in Poland particularly, but not only in Poland, for having collaborated with the Nazis by drawing up lists of people who should be deported and so on. And she took a rather snobbish German Jewish attitude, I think, to the Eastern European Jews. And I think she was wrong to condemn them because they were in a completely impossible position. They felt that by collaborating, maybe they could save some lives, better than no life at all. And to say they were morally wrong to think that, I think is a mistake. Historically, it may be true, as she claims, that if nobody had agreed to collaborate with the Nazis, it would have been made the Nazi enterprise harder, possibly. But I don't think you can condemn them for having made that choice at the time. I hope that answers the question.
Mr. Buruma?
Yes.
My father, who was half English, half French, was parachuted into France to serve with the resistance, which he did very well. But like many families in a situation like that, one of his cousins was shot as a collaborator, which he undoubtedly was. I also wanted to say that it's very interesting that about 10% of the French population probably supported or joined the resistance, but about 30% of the resistors were Jews. And several of those parachuted in with Dad were Jews too. I mean, those were men and women of unbelievably heroic virtue.
Yes.
It's also interesting that, so far as I know, and from my friends in France, among the resistors, they were from the top of society and the bottom of society. It tended to be the middle that just went along as things went along.
Yes, no, and you're quite right. There were many Jews, of course many communists, who were very strong in the French resistance. But no, to point out that if your point is that many of them behaved impeccably and very heroically, I would entirely agree. It's just that it's not something you can expect from most people, especially it makes a difference if you're a young single man or if you have children to worry about.
My father was married with a child.
Yeah, no, I'm not disparaging your father. I'm just saying it's for many people this is an extremely difficult issue, and I would be very reluctant, certainly as a member of the post-war generation, to judge people morally, precisely because as school children we were much too eager to do so.
I take your comments of 80% of people going along, but isn't there a didactic benefit to celebrating people who acted morally?
Yes.
And criticizing people who didn't? I understand your point that we shouldn't.
Yeah, no, I'm very glad you asked that question because it's something I meant to say and I forgot when about what is the meaning of resistance. Now, the meaning of resistance as it unfolds is often not so great because I don't think anything, even these very heroic French resistors did, brought the war, the end of the war any closer. I mean, yes, it made things harder, especially after D-Day, and sabotage of railway lines and so on was useful, but it's of limited use, except that as long as people resist under dictatorship or occupation, it does show that, and that is very important, it does show that the occupying force or the dictatorship is not omnipotent, that they're vulnerable. And that can then lead to other things. So it's important in that way. But the greatest importance is what happens after the dictatorship or the war is over. In that there is a kind of moral base upon which you can start all over again, rebuild society. That you can, by looking at those people who behaved so bravely, and even making them into mythical people, Jean Moulin in France, or you know, there are examples of it. You can show that there is a basis upon which to build. It's not all poisoned and corrupted by the dictatorship or the occupation. And that's where stories of heroism and so on can become a kind of moral compass and well, something to build upon, and which is precisely probably why I grew up on all these stories. They needed to tell themselves these stories.
I'm curious about whether you've done a gender analysis, given what seems to be the high correlation between violence and testosterone. It seems to me that there are not just psychological and sociological factors, but biological ones that seem to have an explanatory.
Well, yeah, I know that argument. I'm a little skeptical about that. Because, yes, of course, if you think in history, if you compare the number of men who behave violently with the number of women, far more men have behaved violently than women, partly, but that may be to have something to do with the general power relations in society. Men had access to guns, women didn't. Men were in positions of power, women weren't. But when you look at instances where women actually did get real power, Golda Meir, Margaret Thatcher, Indira Gandhi, were they any less prone to being belligerent or hard-nosed or tough or, when it was necessary, violent than men? I would say not. And if you think of the behavior of women in, say, concentration camps, and again, there were fewer of them than men, but they were no less vicious. And if you look at the behavior, I now have a 7-year-old daughter. When I see how these little girls behave in second grade, in many ways, they don't bash each other as often as boys do, but they sure can be mean. I don't think this is the answer you wanted, but...
What I want so much is really what the evidence is.
Well, it's very difficult to have evidence of any of this. I think it's all rather speculative. I suppose the one argument to be made on what is probably your side is that women have to take care, are more nurturing because they feel they have responsibility over children and so on, and therefore are less likely to embark on violent enterprises. And it's probably also true that women are less prone to join bands of football hooligans bashing each other up. But there are an awful lot of women cheering them on, and that's true in wars too. These armies, in the old days, when armies would still march through the streets on the way to the front, the people cheering them on hysterically often were women.
I understand that there is a great deal of anti-Semitism in Japan, and I was interviewing a young Japanese woman who was Jewish, but would not let...
A rare person.
Yes. And she was terrified to give any identifying information about herself. Is this rumor true?
Well, I can give a short answer and a long answer. Most Japanese have the foggiest notions of what Jews are. I mean, they don't really know. As is true in many countries which are very dependent on US power, and Japan is certainly one of those countries. There is a lively market in books that explain the hidden power and the conspiracies behind the power of the United States. And that very quickly involves Jews. And I remember during the first Gulf War interviewing a conservative Japanese politician about the Gulf War, and he said, after sort of answering several questions, he was not the sharpest pencil in the box, this man, but he said, well, listen, let's sort of cut all the crap. I've watched television. I saw Henry Kissinger on CNN. We know in Japan what this war is really about. It's the Jews. Now, there is a bit of that, but there is also a whole other history, which is actually fascinating. Is that before the Russo-Japanese War in 1905, the Japanese had never encountered Jews. And they beat the Russians and were much applauded for it by Teddy Roosevelt and others. And they had a lot of white Russian officer POWs who introduced the Japanese to the protocols of the Elders of Zion. And Japan had managed to, one of the reasons they managed to beat Russia in this war is because they had run out of money. And they got Jacob Schiff, a banker in New York, to sell bonds that actually saw the Japanese through. So they saw the protocols of the Elders of Zion. They thought, Jacob Schiff, these people really do run the world. We better be their friends. And so a whole school of so-called Jewish experts came up in the Japanese military intelligence and so on. And in World War II, when there were a lot of Jews in Harbin and Shanghai under Japanese occupation, the Nazis wanted the Japanese to hand them over, and they refused, partly because they didn't want to simply follow German orders, but also because they felt we better keep these people on our side, because, you know, they rarely pull the strings. And that notion can very easily flip back and forth. You know, they're so powerful, they should be our friends. They're so powerful, we should be afraid of them. But it's all rather abstract. And I think it would be an exaggeration to say that Jews in Japan all have to be terrified. And that's never been my impression. I'd rather be Jewish in Japan than, say, in a suburb of Paris.
Have you read Marcel Ranitzky's autobiography and his description of life in the Warsaw Ghetto?
Yes, I have.
And I wonder if you would comment on that as an example of occupation with cooperation and resistance and the rest.
Yes, I don't think we have time to go through his whole autobiography, even that episode, but for those who don't know, Marcel Reich-Ranitzky was born in Berlin, as far as I know, went to school in Berlin, was then, I think his parents still had Polish passports, in any case was kicked out of Germany in the late 1930s, found himself in the ghetto of Woods, I think, during the war, survived, met his wife there, and then became, but was still a highly educated product of the German gymnasium. His head was full of German literature. And although he became Polish, and he spoke, as an adult, spoke German with a thick Polish accent, he was still very much a German literary figure, and then came back to Germany. And in an odd sort of way, he knew more about German literature than most of the Germans who still lived in Germany, and then became a kind of cultural czar, a kind of very, very literary Charlie Rose figure, who on television could create a bestseller or completely demolish a book. And he did this with great theatrical flair and so on. But his story on the ghetto, as far as I can remember it, was in some ways rather, it's remarkable because it's not simply a moralistic condemnation. I mean, he shows all the different shades of grey, I think, amongst the victims as well as the perpetrators. And I can't think of anything else really to say about it, except that it has been translated into English for those of you who don't read German, and it's very much worth reading because he was a great stylist. And he got his chance to become a sort of literary czar in Germany because he became the literary editor of the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, which was then edited by a man called Joachim Fest. And Joachim Fest wrote a famous biography of Hitler and of Albert Speer, and became perhaps a little too friendly with Albert Speer. And he gave a party once at his house outside Frankfurt. And Marcel Reich-Ranitzky was invited. And Fest said to Reich-Ranitzky, I just want you to meet a friend of mine. And he said, Marcel Reich-Ranitzky, Albert Speer. And that's the last time Reich-Ranitzky spoke to him, I think.
what extent did the violence of World War II have on post-World War II Japanese art and culture, like the monster or science fiction movie and anime?
Well, I'll give you a very short answer to something that's obviously complicated, but in the late 40s, early 50s especially, there were more movies and novels and so on written in Japan that dealt very honestly with their experience of the war, their soldiers and so on and so forth, than was true in Germany. In Germany, it only really got going in the 60s. And in Japan, like everywhere else, the sort of the liberal critical voices who'd been very largely on the left got drowned out as the left all over the world began to lose its voice, and the sort of more nationalistic right began to gain. And so right now you get the impression Japan is full of rabid nationalists, including the Prime Minister himself, who simply want to negate everything the Japanese did wrong in the war. But the other voices were always there, and they were particularly strong in the first decades after the war. Thank you.